In the twilight of a bitter autumn, when the leaves seemed to burn with rust and the breeze was sharp as a razor, a somber-faced man stepped from his carriage outside the wrought iron gates of Covenant Academy in Salem, Massachusetts. His name was Thomas Whitmore. A respected merchant, a widower, and the father of a young man named Elijah, now buried beneath a fresh grave marked only with the initials E.W. The man who now faced that building of cold stone and narrow windows was not the same man who had sent his son here with hopes of a Christian education and a promising life. He was another. A man shaped by pain, fueled by rage, driven by what most would call madness, but to him was simply a thirst for truth. The academy was more like a monastery than a school, austere, isolated, surrounded by bare, bone-like trees. Its bell hadn't rung in weeks. The few students visible in the vicinity walked with their heads down, eyes sunken like living ghosts. When Thomas walked through the gates, he was greeted by a silent caretaker who simply pointed the way toward the rectory. There was something rotten in the air. Something that came not from the damp soil or the dry leaves, but from within, as if the academy's walls breathed secrets that would rather die hushed. Inside the rectory, he was greeted with false hospitality by Fletcher, the school's principal and patriarch of the illustrious family that had founded the school. Was tall, thin, with neatly combed gray hair and ice-clear eyes. His voice was calm, each word chosen as if he were delivering a sermon. "Mr. Whitmore, we accept with regret the loss of your son. May the grace of the Lord comfort you." But Thomas did not bow, nor did he weep. He simply held out a folded letter, stained at the edges. He wrote this days before he died. In hiding. In despair. "Tell me, Reverend, why would a young man about to graduate write that he feared his own soul was in danger inside his school?" Fletcher took the letter with hesitant hands. He read it silently. A shadow crossed his face, but his answer was predictable. "Unfortunately, troubled youth writes many things, Mr. Whitmore. It is the burden of sin and rebellion." The sentence was like a blade to Thomas's gut. He clenched his fists. He looked around the room. Pictures of saints, crucifixes, old Bibles, everything gleamed with false piety. My son was not rebellious. He was intelligent, sensitive, and he was afraid of something inside. Osea sighed, stood, and walked slowly to the fireplace. Young people, Mr. Whitmore, often mistake discipline for cruelty, and repentance for fear. But Thomas was no longer listening. His eyes were fixed on a detail behind the desk, an old painting of the founding of the academy. It showed children lined up like soldiers, with forced smiles, and in the center, a young man with empty eyes, very similar to the son who now lay in the city cemetery. His stomach churned. He asked to visit his son's quarters. Fletcher refused. He said the rooms had been sanitized. Thomas didn't insist. He just thanked him, turned around, and left. But he didn't leave. That night, back at the inn where he was staying, Thomas opened his son's letter again. Rereading the words was like driving nails into his chest. Elijah spoke of voices in the middle of the night. Of a cellar where undisciplined students were kept. Of a priest who whispered passages from the Bible while pressing a ruler into the boys' backs. He spoke of Mrs. Martha, the headmaster's wife, who forced the girls to kneel on grains of rice for hours while they prayed. But there was one passage in particular that Thomas read quietly as if it were a prophecy. "Father, if I don't come home, look for the old man with the burned hand. He knows what happened to Andrew, to Michael, and to Sarah. He saw it. He's waiting." The next morning Thomas went to the cemetery. On the way he noticed an old man in torn clothes sitting by the church wall, his hand covered with a dirty cloth. His eyes were white, blind. But as Thomas approached, the old man whispered, "You are the boy's father. He described you to me. Courage, it's in the blood." Thomas crouched down, holding his burned hand. The old man was shaking. "They told me to be quiet. They cut out my tongue, but before that I wrote. I hid it. The words are alive. Like your son." And then, like a priest offering a sacrament, he held out a yellowed package. Inside, wrapped in musty cloth, was a second letter, not from Elijah, but from a girl named Sarah Bloom, dated 1743. The handwriting was shaky. The contents were terrifying. When he returned to the inn, Thomas lit all the candles in the room. He read Sarah's letter as if he were reading a will of the damned. It spoke of bones beneath the altar in the chapel. Of nightly punishments conducted by young Samuel Fletcher, then only 12 years old. Of students taken to the basement and never seen again. Of a secret room behind the library where sinners were left for days without water. Sarah said she had tried to escape. That she had been caught. That writing that letter was her last hope for redemption. And at the end, a sentence that chilled Thomas's soul: "They call it purification, but I saw the devil in their eyes." That night, Thomas didn't sleep, nor the next day. He spent his investigations talking to locals, offering money for information. Some avoided him. Others closed their doors. But between whispers and suspicious glances, he pieced together a puzzle of centuries-old horror. Covenant Academy wasn't just a school. It was a sanctuary of torture disguised as discipline. A facade of light hiding chambers of darkness. The local elite knew. Many had benefited from the silence. But now, there was a father willing to bleed for the truth. Thomas stands before the academy once more. The sky is gray. The wind is stronger. He clutches the letters to his chest and whispers, "If you killed my son, now you will hear me." One by one. It was a night of unearthly silence. No birds sang. Not a branch moved. The village of Sila seemed suspended in time, as if afraid to breathe. And there, in the flickering light of a candle about to go out, Thomas Whitmore read his son's letter for the 100th time. Not like a father seeking comfort, but like a detective wringing out every word for clues, for meaning, for justice. Elijah's handwriting was firm, but marked by desperation. There were tears in the paper, as if he had written in a hurry, perhaps in secret, with shaking hands. Each paragraph was a wound. Each line a revelation. This letter was not a simple account. It was a confession, a warning, a muffled cry that had finally found an ear. "Father," the letter began, "if this reaches you, know that something terrible is happening here. This is not a school. This is a testing ground. A place where the soul is slowly crushed, where faith is used as a weapon. I no longer know what is right or wrong. All I know is that I am afraid." Thomas took a deep breath between each line. It was like reliving the pain of loss, but now multiplied by the image of the suffering Elijah had silently endured. The son he had raised with such care, who had learned to read early, who loved to draw and collect bird feathers, was now describing horrors worthy of a theological nightmare. Elijah described in detail the routine at Covenant Academy. The day began with prayer, fasting, and confession. But the confession was not made to God, it was made to the Fletchers. Osea, the headmaster, looked into the children's eyes and forced them to reveal their innermost thoughts, their dreams, their mistakes, their desires. Everything was written down in a black book. And everything was punished. "They say that thinking is a sin," Elijah wrote. "To dream is a sin. To miss my mother is a sin. To be afraid is a sign of weakness." Punishments came in the form of corporal punishment, isolation in dark rooms, and forced fasts that lasted days. There was a room called the confession room, with locked windows and damp walls. There, according to his son's account, the students were forced to kneel on the cold stone floor for hours, reciting psalms chosen by Samuel Fletcher, the headmaster's son. Samuel was described coldly as a young man with gray eyes and an empty smile. "He likes to see us cry," Elijah wrote. "And when someone faints, he just says the spirit is being broken so the Lord can rebuild it." This wasn't discipline. It was cruel indoctrination. A kind of perverse ritual disguised as education. And worse, everyone there pretended to be normal. The other teachers, the staff, the students themselves, many were too tame to fight back. Elijah said that some accepted the punishments as part of God's plan. Others, the older ones, meted them out with relish. It's as if there are two worlds here. One that you see during the day, full of rules and prayers and routine. And another, at night, where everything is darkness and screams muffled by religious hymns. Thomas clutched the letter so tightly that his fingers trembled. His son's words formed images in his mind: damp hallways, distorted prayers, children being shaped by fear. Elijah said he woke one night to strange noises. Rushing footsteps, doors creaking, and whispers in Latin coming from the chapel. He got up and looked through the crack in the door. He saw 3 hooded figures leading a student, Michael H. down toward the basement. The next day Michael was gone. They said he had been transferred. But no one knew where. "I heard him yell, 'Dad,'" the letter said. "And then I heard a sound, like a shovel hitting wet earth." The chapter then delves into another shocking passage. Elijah describes finding a small journal hidden under a loose floorboard in the study. It belonged to a girl named Sarah Bloom and it looked old. He began reading it in secret, just a few pages at a time. It was in this journal that Elijah learned about the term, purification offering, used to describe students who disappeared. Sarah spoke of marks on her arms, of night visions, of prayers that caused her to faint. But what frightened Elijah the most was the last page of the journal, where the girl said she had seen something that was not human on the chapel altar. A symbol carved into wood, hidden under the sacred carpet. A symbol that did not belong to any Christian doctrine. It is an eye with flames around it. A symbol that burns just to look at, she wrote. Elijah drew this symbol at the end of the letter. Thomas, rereading that symbol, felt a chill. Something about that drawing was wrong. Desecrating. He decided to keep the letter, but kept the paper with the symbol folded in his pocket. He sensed that this was not just a daydream of a terrified child. It was a key. A password. A clue. Elijah ended his letter by saying, "If I don't come back, don't let them bury me here. This place doesn't deserve my ashes. Take my bones back home. And find out the truth, Dad. For all of us." That last sentence echoed in Thomas's mind like thunder. For all of us. It wasn't just about Elijah. It was about Michael, Sarah, Andrew, and so many others whose names he didn't even know yet. His son's suffering was part of something much bigger. Something methodical, planned, and more terrible than he could have imagined. The letter, which was supposed to be a goodbye, had become a map to hell. Thomas knew he could no longer retreat. He had crossed an invisible line, a boundary between the world of men and the abyss of secrets. Covenant Academy was not just an elite school. It was a dark temple where people worshipped something that wore faith as a mask. And now he was the heretic who dared to defy the priests of this false sanctity. He looked once more at the symbol engraved by his son. The candle in the room flickered. And in that instant, something inside him awakened. It was not just anger. It was purpose. It was the certainty that Elijah had left him a mission. And he would fulfill it even if it cost him his own life. The morning after reading Elijah's letter, Thomas Whitmore left the inn like a man at war. But his weapon was not a sword. It was the truth. And the ammunition was the words written in blood and fear by his own son. He now had a name, Sarah Bloom. He had a symbol drawn by childish hands, and he had a goal, to prove that his son did not die of natural causes. Elijah had been silenced, like so many others, but not without leaving a trace. And that was what Thomas, his soul torn apart, pursued with the precision of a hunter. His first stop was the small town library attached to the old church. The building, clad in black stone and with stained glass windows covered in dust, seemed to carry the memories of the past like a living tombstone. The librarian, a thin man with a suspicious look, refused help. "School records are sealed by order of the academy itself," he muttered. But Thomas didn't need help, he needed silence. And, under the pretext of consulting colonial newspapers, he plunged into the archives like a dog sniffing out corpses. And it was there, among yellowed sheets and pages that exhaled the odor of oblivion, that he found what should not have survived: the old entrance book of the Covenant Academy. The hardcover, cracked leather book contained dates, student names, ages, enrollment dates. And the gaps. Lots of gaps. At certain periods, especially between 1735 and 1760, the records appeared with scratches, pages torn out, or simply blank. But in the bottom corners of some pages, barely visible, Thomas noticed small handwritten initials in faded ink. SBAMMHEW. These were the same initials that appeared on the letters. Sarah Bloom, Andrew McCarthy, Michael Hartley, Elijah Whitmore. Names that officially had no records of leaving, no transfers, no mention of death. Just silence, as if they had evaporated into thin air. With quick notes, Thomas began to compile his own list, cross-referencing it with other sources in the library, old obituaries, correspondence, even account books of local parents. And he discovered something even more disturbing. Dozens of families had enrolled children at Covenant and never mentioned them again in later records. As if they had given up on remembering. As if a shadow had fallen over their memory. In many cases, the young people's names had even disappeared from family trees. It was as if they had been erased from history. Thomas's list grew. It went from 7 names to 23, then to 39, until it reached 62. All of them had a similar pattern, enrolled between 1735 and 1761. Most were motherless orphans or children of influential parents who wanted to correct rebellious behavior. Many had been sent to school after episodes of insubordination, moral deviations, or spiritual crises. These were common expressions in admission letters. But the fate of all was the same: disappearance, silence, or a supposed natural death that was never explained. One afternoon, as he was leaving the library, Thomas met a gray-haired woman sitting alone on a bench near the cemetery. She seemed to be waiting for him. When he approached, she simply said, "You are the father of the boy who saw too much." Thomas stopped. She held out a small wooden cross, handmade. My brother was a student at the academy. In 1742. His name was Jacob. Thomas sat beside her. She told him everything as if finally pouring out decades of pent-up grief. Jacob had been a brilliant boy. He dreamed of being a painter. But he was restless. He questioned everything. His devout mother thought school would put him on the right path. 3 months later he was gone. The letter said he had run away. But his body was never found. And the woman, her eyes moist, whispered, "It wasn't running away. It was sacrifice." Thomas wrote down Jacob's name. He was number 67 on the list. Back at the inn he reorganized the data. He created columns, dates, ages. And that's when he noticed an even darker pattern. Most of the missing people turned 12 the year they disappeared. A symbolic age. Biblical. The age when Jesus went to the temple. The age of spiritual maturity, according to many religious texts. Was it a coincidence? Or part of a planned ritual? It was at this point in the investigation that Thomas decided to return to the academy, not as a visitor, but as an undercover agent. At night, in the light rain, he climbed over the back wall, armed only with a flashlight and the letters. He walked through the silent hallways. The place seemed deserted. Until he saw a light on in the school's internal library. He hid behind a bookshelf and looked. It was Martha Fletcher, sitting writing something. Beside her, a small black notebook. And it was when she left that Thomas acted. He broke into the room and found what appeared to be the unofficial academy register. The complete list. Every name. Every punishment. Every spiritual failure. And next to many names, a black cross. Symbol of purging. He leafed through until he reached the W. Elijah was there. With the cross. With a date next to it, September 15, 1761. The day of purification. Thomas left the school with the notebook hidden under his shirt. When he arrived at the inn, he confirmed what he had already feared. He counted 89 names. 89 young men. 89 black crosses. No explanation. No burial. No justice. The chapter ends with Thomas writing all the names by hand, one by one on a sheet of paper. Silently. Weeping. Muttering the names like lost prayers. Each name was a life. A cry. A cry for help that had spanned decades. And now he was the only one listening. In Saleh, history was written by hands that held both the pen and the whip. And no hand was more influential, more feared, more revered than that of the Fletcher family. When Thomas Whitmore began to follow in the footsteps of the past, it didn't take long for him to realize that Hosea, Marta, and Samuel were not just administrators of Covenant Academy, they were the foundations of a moral, political, and religious empire that shaped the destiny of this God-forsaken city. Every stone in the academy bore their signature. Every unwritten law, every prayer whispered from silent pulpits, every averted glance at a child suffering, all revolved around that family with its pious facade and dark essence. Hosea Fletcher, the patriarch, was considered the holiest of men. An eloquent preacher, a defender of rigid doctrine, a symbol of austere and inflexible masculinity. It was common to see him at the Church of the Redeemer services reciting psalms with tears in his eyes and a choked voice. But Thomas discovered, in letters hidden deep in an abandoned trunk in the library, that Hosea was more than an educator. He was the architect of a theological system of punishment and absolute obedience. A man who mixed biblical passages with old Puritan codes, creating a kind of internal doctrine that justified punishments, deprivations, and even deaths in the name of redemption. An excerpt from one of his secret sermons said, "The impure body must be martyred so that the soul may be received into the kingdom." Words spoken not to adults, but to children. His wife, Martha Fletcher, was the guardian of feminine purity. A pale-faced, fixed-eyed woman with a soft step, she seemed like a living statue molded from silence and venom. She was a constant presence among the girls at the academy. She dictated what they wore, what they read, what they ate, and how they prayed. But her obsession went beyond morality. Records found in the basement revealed that Marta ran a program of womb cleansing, which included forced diets, enema pumping, and public humiliation. Notebooks written by former students recounted how she placed menstruating students in penitential quarantine, forcing them to fast and pray until their blood was redeemed. Many fainted. Some never returned to class. Samuel, the heir, was the sharpest cog in that machine. He grew up in his father's shadow, learning to torture with a smile and pray with clenched fists. At 15 he was already leading confession sessions. At 18 he was in charge of the spiritual hardening program, which consisted of extreme physical and emotional tests, always accompanied by forced readings of apocalyptic passages. A manuscript hidden behind the chapel altar revealed one of his favorite methods, the Daniel fast in reverse, in which students were forced to eat ashes of paper with verses on them while kneeling on rocks. Some developed infections. Others lost teeth. But no one dared to report him. Samuel was protected, by the church, by society, by the very Bible he distorted. But the Fletchers' power didn't stop within the walls of the academy. They were infiltrated at every level of the community. They were relatives of judges, business associates, godparents to the children of city councilmen. Thomas discovered that for 3 decades, no real inspections had been conducted at the school. Complaints went unanswered. Parents who raised questions disappeared or received generous financial settlements. There were even reports that some of Boston's elite sent their most problematic children to the academy as a kind of reform school in disguise. And even more disturbing, some of these parents knew exactly what was going on there. They were paying not for education, but for correction, for spiritual healing, for silence. In a letter dated 1755, found in a box of sealed correspondence, an influential father writes to Hosea, "Burn the spirit of Thomas Jr. He has dared to defy his mother and refuses to kneel before the holy book. Do what is necessary. And if necessary, use the darkness to lead him to the light." The signature was that of a local senator. The conclusion was inescapable. Covenant was not an isolated deviation. It was part of a network. A well-oiled machine in which the Fletchers operated as high priests of a sick cult, approved by a society blinded by convenience. Thomas then began touring the Sala area, seeking out former academy staff. In a rundown asylum, he found the gardener from the 1740s. A man with no fingers on his left hand who spoke only in whispers. But when he saw the symbol Elijah had drawn, the old man burst into tears. Through his tears he uttered 3 words, "They offered children." And he pointed to the Bible he carried with him, the cover torn and a page marked, Leviticus 20 verse 2, "Any man of the children of Israel, who offers any of his seed to Molech, shall surely be put to death." That reference changed everything. Molech, the pagan god of antiquity, to whom children were sacrificed. It wasn't just about twisted doctrine. It was hidden idolatry. It was ritual perversion masquerading as Christian faith. Thomas understood. The Fletchers weren't just justifying punishments with the Bible. They were disguising pagan worship under psalms. The cross was a mask. The altar a disguise. The academy, a profane temple hidden under sacred robes. The chapter ends with Thomas back in the school chapel, alone, staring at the altar. He rips off the carpet and finds, etched into the wood, the same symbol that Sarah had described and Elijah had drawn, a flaming eye surrounded by spirals. He no longer needs proof. Now he needs allies. Because what he has discovered is not just about his son's death. It is about a bloodline that has weaponized faith and used holiness as a shield against the oldest evil in existence. Time seemed to stand still at Covenant Academy. Every brick, every board, every crevice bore the weight of centuries of hushed secrets. But it was beneath the surface, beneath the cold stone floor, that the horrors found their voices. And it was there, in the hidden cellars beneath the chapel, that Thomas Whitmore found the answers that would plunge him deeper than he could ever have imagined. The cellar was not on any map of the academy. No current staff member knew, or admitted to knowing, of its existence. But it was there, sealed with ancient wood covered in weathered symbols, and locked with a rusty padlock shaped like an inverted cross. It was the blind gardener who led him there. No words, only gestures. When Thomas asked what was behind the door, Whitmore whispered, "The voices still cry." The padlock was broken with a jerk of the lever. The smell that emerged from it was not just of mold or rotting wood, it was something thicker. An odor of agony. Of things that should have been forgotten. Flashlight in hand, Thomas walked down the dusty steps and saw what no living soul should have seen. Narrow corridors of damp stone and cracked wood, with tiny cells on either side. In each cell was a wooden bed with leather straps. There were scratch marks on the walls as if children had tried to escape using their fingernails. On some drawings scrawled, eyes, crooked crosses, crying faces. And on one of the doors, written in charcoal, "Forgive me, Lord, for not being pure enough." The voices seemed to echo off the stone. Thomas closed his eyes and could almost hear them. Not words but murmurs, moans, whispers of despair trapped in time. In one of the cells he found a crucifix made of small bones, human bones. A symbol of twisted, desperate faith. Beside it, a musty notebook still legible. It wasn't a student's. It was Samuel Fletcher's. And when he opened it, Thomas felt he was crossing a line of no return. Samuel's diary was an unrepentant confession. Each page revealed the construction of a mind shaped by sadism, by the adoration of suffering, and by the conviction that the pain of others was a divine instrument. He wrote with elegance and coldness, "Today young Elias resisted the fast. Regrettable. 3 hours in cell 9 taught him that hunger is the true baptism." In another passage, "Girls still cry when they see the dark water. But they need to learn. Purity lies in the acceptance of punishment." It was like reading the diary of a monster, but one who saw himself as a martyr, as a prophet, as a saint. Samuel described experiences with methods of sensory deprivation, extreme isolation, and even the use of natural drugs mixed with the host, to provoke visions that he called epiphanies of repentance. Today the child saw the hand of the Lord in flames. He cried on his knees for 4 hours. His soul is beginning to bend. It was not an isolated case of madness. It was a system, planned, executed with rigor, and, most frighteningly, proudly documented. Later, the diary revealed something even more horrifying: constant references to a ritual called the Night of the Turning Light. Samuel wrote, "The father leads. The mother prepares. I open the way." According to him, this ritual was performed once a year on the longest night of winter. 3 children were chosen. 3 tests were administered: fasting, silence, and sacrifice. In one of the accounts, Samuel writes, "The girl refused the last test. She struggled. She screamed. But the altar accepted her blood. And the light turned. The door opened." This was no metaphor. It was literal description. And Thomas understood. They were killing. They were offering innocent lives in the name of a divine light that did not come from God, but from something much older, much darker. At the bottom of the cellar was one last door, locked, with symbols in every direction. There was no key. But when he put his hand on the latch, Thomas felt the metal pulse with cold. As he pushed, the wood creaked like a choked scream. Inside, a circular room with a vaulted ceiling. In the center, a stone altar covered in wax residue, dark stains, and twisted iron instruments. On the walls, inscriptions that were not Latin, Hebrew, or any known language. And on the floor, there were bones. Many, small, fragile, piled up like offerings. In the corner, a wooden box with burned crosses. Inside it, pieces of paper rolled up like parchment, all with names. Many already known to Thomas. Others never before seen. The total, 89. Those were the voices from the cellar. Souls crushed under the weight of twisted faith. Lives sacrificed in the name of an empty promise. Thomas fell to his knees. Not in prayer, but in mourning. For the loss of his son. For the lives that were erased. And for having discovered that evil, when it hides behind a cross, becomes almost impossible to combat. He walked out of that basement with dry eyes and a burning heart. The mission had changed. It was no longer about answers. It was about justice and revenge. For Elijah. For Sarah. For Jacob. For all the names that should not be spoken, but that now echoed in his mind like unholy hymns. The weight of the discoveries in the Covenant Academy's basement had shattered something inside Thomas Whitmore. It wasn't just the knowledge that his son had been tortured to death, but the unbearable revelation that dozens of other innocent people had shared the same fate, and worse, that no one had ever been held accountable. Emerging from those pits of stone and pain, Thomas was no longer a grieving father. He had become the bearer of a truth that the world refused to hear. And the closer he got to justice, the more he realized that justice in this land was a poorly told joke. Written on wax paper and erased with the gold of hypocrisy. Decades passed. Salah changed its name. Covenant Academy closed in the following years after the sudden illness that killed Fletcher and the mysterious disappearance of Marta and Samuel. The building stood empty for nearly 2 centuries, until it was transformed into a community center and then fell into ruins. But it wasn't until 1987, during the restoration of Boston's historic Old North Church, that the buried truth resurfaced, literally. Workers were excavating the crypt beneath the main altar when an iron lever hit a hidden cavity. As they removed the stones, they found a small, sealed chamber filled with human bones. The official report said, disordered remains of about 20 children, estimated to be between 10 and 13 years of age. There was also a locked wooden chest containing the Covenant Academy record books, the same ones that Thomas Whitmore had described in his diary, kept by his descendants. That discovery, hushed up for decades, only came to light thanks to an anonymous tip to the local press. And when the records were finally examined, the scandal exploded. But contrary to what was expected, there was no revolt. There were no cries in the streets. There was silence. A comfortable silence. A silence that protected. The sixth chapter delves into the political maze that surrounded the attempt to hold the Fletchers accountable, even so many years after the crimes. Documents showed that the family name had been carefully preserved over the generations. Osea's descendants became politicians, bankers, religious leaders. And all, without exception, had invested large sums of money in historic preservation projects in the city. In return, Covenant Academy was described in museums as a radical educational experiment by 18th century standards, never as the site of a murderous cult masquerading as a Christian school. The episode then reveals that in the 1990s, a special commission was formed by historians, anthropologists and legal experts to evaluate the material found in the church. The goal was to investigate whether the crimes committed by the Fletcher family could, even after so much time, be recognized as part of an educational genocide, a new but appropriate term. But the project never moved forward. Documents disappeared. Witnesses were coerced. One of the archaeologists involved was found dead at home with a suicide note, typed with a digital signature. It all reeked of the same stale rot that had hung over academia 2 centuries earlier. A retired pastor who had been a student at the school as a child, agreed to be interviewed in 1991. In tears he revealed, "They said it was evidence from God. But we knew it wasn't God. It was something older. Something that lived in the chapel on the floor in Samuel's eyes." He said that even as a child he was forced to write letters of confession in which he claimed to have demonic visions, letters used as proof of possession, and that he once saw a girl being taken by Martha Fletcher to the basement and never returned. The girl's name was Abigail. She was 11 years old. "We made a cross out of branches and buried her in the woods, but there was no body, only fear." The victims' families, now made up of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, attempted to file a class action lawsuit in 1992, demanding that the remains found at the Old North Church be identified and buried with dignity, with names. But they met with brutal legal resistance. They argued that there was insufficient forensic evidence to attribute the bones to the missing Covenant members, and that the records written by Thomas Whitmore, because they were personal and not official, had no legal validity. It was as if the story were a myth. As if the horror had been merely a literary invention by a father driven mad by grief. Thomas died without seeing justice. But he left a trail. The diary, which he rewrote by hand dozens of times, was kept by his children. His detailed notes, cross-references of names, dates, and physical descriptions of the missing, were compared decades later with the records found at the church. The match was 91%. Still, it wasn't enough. No exhumation was authorized. No member of the Fletcher family was convicted posthumously. No memorial was erected. The chapter closes with the voice of a historian: "Human judgment has failed. The justice of men has a deadline, a price, and convenience. But there is another judgment. One that happens when we close our eyes. When the last forgotten name is whispered by someone. When the souls crying out from the basement are finally heard." And then the camera pans down through the cracks of the ancient Covenant altar, revealing, in the shadows, 89 names scratched in stone. Silence. A deep, almost sacred silence. The kind of silence that precedes a revelation. In this chapter, there is no mystery to be unraveled, no suspense to be maintained. What is presented before us now are names. Just names. But each of these names carries a universe of pain, of broken promises, of lives that could never be lived. They were not just victims. They were martyrs of a perverse system, executed under the guise of faith and legitimized by the silence of a society that preferred not to see. This chapter is theirs. And theirs alone. Thomas Whitmore wrote each name by hand. Not because he needed to catalog it, but because he needed to remember. Because, for him, forgetting would be the second death of those young people. And so we begin like this, by reading these names in a low voice, almost in lamentation. Elijah Whitmore, Sarah Blue, Jacob Morton, Abigail Lehman, Andrew McCarthy, Michael Hartley, Elizabeth Grace, Isaac Turner, Anna Mayfield. Thomas read, wrote, wept, and moved on. There were 89 in total. But he didn't treat them as numbers. Each name was a face in his mind. A scream in the dark. A candle lit in the abyss. The records, official or otherwise, said little about their personalities. But in the last years of his life, Thomas interviewed parents, siblings, servants, even those who preferred to deny it. He gathered letters, portraits, and sentences written in torn notebooks. And with that, he reconstructed fragments of who they were. Elijah, his son, was fascinated by birds. He kept feathers as if they were relics. Sarah loved to play the flute and drew stars in the margins of books. Jacob dreamed of traveling by ship and seeing the sea. Abigail was shy, but she wrote poems that she hid in glass jars buried in the school garden. Each child had a light of their own, an identity, a path that was taken from them. They did not die by accident. They did not fall ill by chance. They were systematically silenced, corrected, broken. Many wrote letters that were never sent. And now here their excerpts are read for the first time. Dad, I can't pray anymore. Praying hurts here. Mommy, I promise I'll be good, just get me out of here. I saw a red light on the ceiling of the chapel. They say it's God, but it doesn't look like it. Tonight was the night of the test. They said I was impure. The voices of these martyrs are united by a common thread, the cry for love, for compassion, for true mercy. But they received only rules, whippings, and soulless chants. Many died slowly, not physically but spiritually. They became shadows within themselves. Until the pain turned into absolute silence. Those who resisted paid with their lives. Those who accepted died inside before their bodies were taken to the basement. Covenant Academy did not just kill bodies. It murdered hope, imagination, and childhood. The chapter also shows, with visual dramatization, what the routine of these children was like. They woke up before the sun, walked barefoot through cold hallways, knelt for hours, fasted while listening to sermons about guilt, sin, and punishment. There was no recess. There was no color. Only gray. Only surveillance. Every laugh was suspicious. Every tear a sign of weakness. When someone disappeared, it was as if they had never existed. The dormitories were regrouped. The clothes were redistributed. And the names erased. But Thomas rescued them. One by one. He wrote their stories in his diary, like a prophet in reverse, who instead of foreseeing the future, refuses to forget the past. They died before the eyes of the world, he wrote. But as long as I live, they will live in my every word. And when I am gone, let others write. Let others say their names. For as long as there is someone to call them, they will not be alone. And so we reach the climax of this episode. A sequence of names being read aloud with symbolic images, aging portraits, letters disintegrating in the wind, crosses stuck in dark earth. The music swells. The screen fades to black. And one by one the names of the 89 appear. Each name fills the entire screen. No rush. No cut. Because this is the tribute they never received. The funeral that was never held. The burial that never happened. At the end, a single sentence appears. They did not die in vain. For now the world hears them. And then the camera returns to the chapel's desecrated altar, where Thomas, in his final days of life, placed a handwritten wooden plaque. Here lie the children the world ignored. But heaven never forgot.